2NURFM.com, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Politics with Dr. Jim Jones from the University of Newcastle. Thanks to our sponsor, Sugar Valley Lifestyle Estate. Morning, Jim.
Good morning, Meryl.
Well, we're back at it. I noticed Tanya Plibersek yesterday in Parliament stood up and said to the Prime Minister, is this just the Abbott government with a more personable salesman? Off the back of lots of GST questions, Jim. What's going on with this GST, in your opinion?
Well, it's difficult to be definitive about what's going on. What we can say is that a number of state premiers are keen to have the GST lifted so that they can get a larger share of the tax cake.
That's just their cash registers going ka-ching, ka-ching.
Well, yes, and if you're the Premier of Western Australia and possibly the Premier of Queensland, you will be going, we're going to lose revenue rapidly because the resources boom is dying out and we're not going to get the same level of royalties. It's time for the federal government to compensate us and to give us some more money. So there's that pressure, but they're not the only premiers either who are pushing for it. The Business Council is also keen to see something of a GST increase, so that their argument is largely around reducing company tax, but also as a bit of I suppose, a popular sales pitch to say, well, we can reduce income tax if we boost the GST. Now, that in itself is probably short-sighted, and it's not where I think Malcolm Turnbull would want to go, because in some respects, while there might be enough money to go around for other issues, projects and so forth, reducing income tax and reducing corporate tax is almost like saying, well, we're going to raise taxes in one area, but we're going to reduce them in another area, and the balance may well be, a zero-sum outcome. The rationale for increasing the GST would, I think from Malcolm Turnbull's perspective, would be to try and ensure that there's a revenue for the government to be able to actually expand the economy, to build the economy, rather than just simply marking time. Sure, for the average voter, getting a personal tax cut would be great, but we're not a highly taxed nation to begin with. When we look at where we are in relation to the OECD countries, personal income tax is certainly not extravagant. And in fact, we've been having, probably over the past 20 years, quite considerable cuts. The problem for Malcolm Turnbull really is how to sell an increase in consumption tax, which is what the GST is, without raising sort of a backlash from voters. But he's also facing the problem of declining revenues overall. That's the big issue.
It is, because, let's face it, we are an ageing society. Our tax base is shrinking, and we do need to get more young people into work paying income tax to become part of that tax base. And it's also really interesting. Paul Keating wrote an interesting piece last week about this. He actually, it was quite a mixed message actually in his article. He argued for a GST increase up to about 12%, saying that the money could go to perhaps hospitals and the medical fraternity, and we needed more of that. But then he said much over that was a bit of a stretch, and he was quite against a 15% GST. So that's coming from a man who was quite keen on a broad-based consumption tax once in the 80s.
Well, that's true, and it's sort of typical of Paul Keating's canniness politically. So he's saying, I'm only going to tax you a little bit, so it won't hurt as much.
Maybe there's something for Malcolm Turnbull to learn in this.
Well, perhaps. They're cut from the same cloth in many respects in terms of their political astuteness. But I think that the issue here for Malcolm Turnbull is, and he's sort of pushed it out fairly cleanly, or fairly clearly, I should say, that the way in which he wants to operate is, what will this do for economic growth? And if it is a zero-sum issue, if it's just simply to give people income tax relief on the one hand, rather than providing necessary resources on the other to actually expand the economy, there are a whole range of areas perhaps which I think people would like to see some increased government activity, health and education. I think that's where Paul Keating was able to sort of justify his 2% increase. If we spend it on improving health, so be it. The point about the declining tax base in terms of an ageing population, to some extent, I think that's been exaggerated to sort of give the sort of tax argument a bit more traction. But the real issue is that in many respects, is that the capacity, shall we say, of the country to earn export income has declined or is declining at present. We're not really increasing our manufacturing base.
That's
and
where the
value
innovation
add.
push comes from, doesn't it?
Yes, and I think there's a lot of talk about innovation, and there will certainly be a lot happening, but whether it's enough to generate the level of tax revenue that the government needs, and that's really where the push for the GST gets a lot more of its traction. Do we need to expand it? Well, there's a lot of other things that the government could do, and I know the union movement has made a couple of comments about if, I think it was the Secretary of the Trade Union movement saying, well, if companies paid their fair share of tax, perhaps it might be less pressure for the government to expand the GST.
This might be the gift that Bill Shorten has been looking for as well. It's the one thing that potentially the opposition can hang their hat on, and I heard him say very clearly a vote for Labor is a vote, against raising the GST. Might this be that sort of miracle moment for Bill Shorten in which he can open the window and have a good look at this next election? Well, certainly there's an opportunity for Labor to use the GST as an election platform to sort of differentiate itself from the coalition and to sort of campaign against the GST. But if it has nothing in its place, if its ability to offer an alternative, shall we say, and explain how the revenue is going to grow without the GST, then in some respects the government is still going to be on, shall we say, on the front foot, and it's going to actually have Bill Shorten currently where he is boxed into a corner. Now, whether Shorten can figure out a way out of that corner, jump out of the box and come up with something a little bit more progressive, aggressive and serviceable and creative for the Labor Party, he's going to go to the elections with Malcolm Turnbull having him on a string. Yes. It's Dr. Jim Joes at Talking Politics. We do it every Wednesday. Jim, thank you so much. We will... I say Wednesday each week and it's really Tuesday. I do know it's Tuesday. I know what day it is, luckily. Catch you next Tuesday.
Okay, Meryl, no problem.
Just after 9:20. Dr. Jim Joes from the University of Newcastle talks to us about politics each week. And quite interestingly, of course, Paul Keating did win that unwinnable election in the 90s, fighting against the GST after he'd wanted one, so maybe Bill Shorten will take a leaf out of his book as well. He just keeps coming back. He's like the phoenix, is Paul Keating. 2NURFM.